Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, I'm going to be going over my Obsidian Flames Buylist. The set is now legal for purchase and will be coming to tournament legality on the 25th of August, so perfect time to start picking up these cards and getting ready to play with them. Let's start off with our core essentials. These are cards that I'm expecting to be involved in tier 1 or 2 contenders or have an obvious amount of future potential. And it's actually not too difficult and not too expensive this time around, as we only really are looking at one flagship archetype from this set in my opinion, and that's going to be the Charizard EX archetype, where you will be needing to pick up probably a 4-1-3 line where you're getting some Charmanders and the Charmeleon. These seem to be the optimal ones right now from the latest set. And Charizard does just seem to hit the ground running. 330 hit points is monstrous. We know Dark typing is fantastic, allowing us to hit into Gardevoir EX very easily and early on in the game, and also challenging the Mew players, whilst also just having late game very high damage beat stick potential as that Burning Darkness gets more and more powerful as the game progresses. I'm expecting this archetype to go alongside oftentimes Arceus and Pidgeot, but also could be like a barrel-based line alongside like Entei and Forest Seal Stone as well. I've even seen murmurings of like a Palkia Greninja list that has a ton of water energy and then a handful of fire energy late game for a sort of Rare Candy Zard pivot package, I suppose, as a later game option. But the bottom line is, Charizard just has insane stats, really high hit points, really high damage output, and accelerates energy from the deck inherently, so it allows us to cheat space where we don't need as many switching cards because we can simply pull energy out of the deck to pay retreat out of certain Pokemon, but also just means that we can power up the stage 2 very, very easily. Seems to be a very good archetype out the gate. I'm expecting this to be a tier 1 or 2 contender just immediately, and that's also why I've got a Victini EX and an Entei on here. I feel like these are often not going to make it into Charizard list, but they do still have a decent amount of potential. The Victini does 220 damage, which we can kind of do with other things here and there, but I feel like as we move towards more EXs, where Arceus can no longer just belt up and hit 230, it's going to be relevant somewhat to having Victini in here that has that vanilla 220 threshold that can actually hit through fellow EX Pokemon. So I feel like that could become a more relevant card later down the line. Also, Entei is just a high hit point, chunky single prize threat, and I think at the moment it's not really making it into the Charizard builds that I've been seeing, but there's always a reason to like single prizes that can be immediately powered up by an Infernal Rain ability from Charizard, and I feel like Entei fits that slot pretty reasonably. So I don't expect those cards to make it into Charizard immediately, but they have obvious future potential in an archetype that, you know, hits the ground running and is going to be very powerful. Pidgeot EX, I'm saying get a 2-0-2 line probably of the Pidgeots. It seems to be good enough, definitely for at least the Charizard archetype right now, and maybe experimented with other archetypes that have rare candies in them, like Baxcalibur, for example. And I feel that that quick search ability, you know, even if you only get to use this ability 2 or 3 times in a game, that still seems to be a huge amount of value, where you're getting cherry pick of some really big cards throughout the game. Oftentimes it's going to be crucial supporters like Boss's Orders, as well as just, you know, key pieces to keep you in the game. So it seems to be a powerful enough card. It's already making it in, you know, a new tier 1 archetype in Charizard. So I do think this is worth picking up. And we know this card is so flexible. As we see more rare candy style decks come out into the format, this is going to become more versatile and more worthwhile in decks. Even in the 151 set, we're getting an upgrade to our Pidgey as well that has a call for family attack. So we're stuck with the 60 hit point one for now, but there will be an even better Pidgey in the following set in September. And this gives even more reason to like Pidgeot coming into your deck list, because then Pidgey becomes an optimal going second starter. So that's another thing to bear in mind. There's only one tool and a couple stadium cards that I think are really worth picking up from the get-go. The Vengeful Punch, very similar to the Box of Disaster, which we actually saw win the World Championships in the Mew players list from Vance. Vengeful Punch is kind of like a more universal tool that we can have as a tech card for Gardevoir. Actually a pretty big tech card. I haven't seen much talk about this card, but I actually think it's very important for the format that we're going into. Even if decks only play one copy of this card, it can help swing a Gardevoir matchup, which I think is huge. The Town Store Stadium, I'm also a really big fan of. We have Forest Seal Stone in the format, we have Sky Seal Stone still fairly relevant in the format, and we have damage mods right now from our tool cards. So a lot of reasons to like Town Store, simply because we have seen archetypes playing 3 copies of Forest Seal Stone. Now just going down to even like 2 or 1 copy of Forest and then adding in additional stadiums makes your decks more able to deal with Path to the Peak, which I think is absolutely massive, right? We know Path is a huge card in the game, and now rather than having the Forest Hill Stones, which are insta-plays, I suppose, but you now have a multifaceted card in that you're protecting yourself around Path naturally throughout the game, whilst also having a tutor for the Forest Hill Stone that then tutors you into anything else. So I feel like this card immediately goes into, Mew as like a 1 or 2 count probably, because they also sometimes play Gloves and Belt as well as their Forest Hill Stone, and it can find its way into a handful of other archetypes as well, where we are basically just warping the deck to have a variety package of tool cards, and I think that could be like a reasonable stadium at that stage to allow you to cherry pick things as and when. Like, I feel like I'm a Rhydon player could certainly be playing a couple copies of the Town Store. I think there could be builds of Charizard that even play this if they are playing a Forest Hill Stone package with NTV. So I feel like this is a reasonable card to get 2 copies of. The Pokemon League headquarters, being that disruptive stadium card where you're increasing the attack cost of basic Pokemon by 1, actually can be pretty useful, and I think we know this could be frustrating for Lost Zone players as we are hitting them with Iono and now a Pokemon League HQ. You're making it less easy for them to cycle Sableye turn by turn by turn, forcing them to find gates off of those low hand sizes to get their Sableyes working and whatnot. So I feel like this could be a reasonable tech card and definitely worth picking up. Then for the other EXs, I do think Glimmora could end up being sort of roguey deck in the game. Fighting type coverage is actually pretty good right now because we are seeing Arc pop up in Charizard builds as well as, the remaining Arc decks in format that are always kind of present where they're powering up other V-Star and V-Maxes. So having fighting type coverage is pretty strong. It deals 140, which is enough to deal with Arceus, which is obviously massive. And I also think Charizard probably pushes Lugia out a little bit of the format because it's just so much bigger than it and can punch through things much more effectively. So I think, Lugia having that big resist to fighting isn't that big of a deal. And also that Dustfield is just frustrating. I think it's really annoying for Guardy players, Charizard players, Chen Pao players to just play 3 bench Pokemon is really awkward for many archetypes. So I do think Glimmora could end up being like a quad-style deck, although it doesn't have that higher damage output. I could also see it going alongside, like Urshifu, for example, or even like a Palkia Glimmora thing could work out. I'm basically thinking decks that don't want to commit one of their 3 board spaces to being a Manaphy would allow Glimmora to have some interesting like sniping presence in the deck. So I feel like there's stuff to be done with Glimmora, and I think it could end up being sort of tier 2, maybe a little bit sub tier 2, but just because of that Dustfield ability being so frustrating for a number of the setup decks that we have in the game right now, I think it could find its place in the metagame. The Miraidon, I just think, is just a decent one-off copy that you could add to current Miraidon base builds. That Techno Turbo allows you to kind of get a refund of energy attachments where it gets one immediately from the discard pile to one of your bench. So you get that early generator, you get that early KO on single prize Pokemon, only dealing that 150, of course. But if you're going through a single prize Pokemon, you have a natural pivot in the deck in Free Retreat now, which we've seen previously from like Zeraora going into the list as a single prize Mon. But now you also are able to get even more energy from the discard pile. So you're committing early generators and attachments to this Miraidon, but then it also helps you out getting your next one ready to go. So that really helps with a chain, especially if we're going up to other EX decks where there are a number of single prizes in the opening stages, but then we need the higher damage output in the later stages. So Miraidon powering up and throwing energies around the board can make Raichu more effective, or just get another Miraidon EX ready to go in the mix, the Scarlet Violet base set one. So yeah, it seems like a decent one-off that could be considered, especially because it has Free Retreat. It just seems like a really nice card, to be honest with you. Onto the Believer Buylist then. Still not a huge amount in terms of trainers. There are 2 supporters in the set that I do think are pretty reasonable and do have decent potential. The first would be Gita, which allows us to attach 2 basic energy to one of our Pokemon, but it means we cannot attack that turn. So we're not drawing many cards. We're probably going to have to use like Fish or Squawk or whatever to try and get this reliably. And this is basically trying to help out against archetypes that don't really have decent energy acceleration inbuilt within their archetype. So I'm looking at things like the Revavroom in the bottom right of the screen. I'm looking at Regidrago V-Star. I'm looking at a few other of these like decent payoff Pokemon that don't have good enough energy acceleration to actually get rolling. And I feel like Gita is okay for that, but I do think this is still like kind of clunky in the first place. And it does kind of leave yourself, especially if you've gone second and then used the Gita, if your opponent just, evolves, bosses orders, knocks out your guy, then you're still in really bad shape. So I feel like it's still a bit of a bait supporter, to be honest with you, but I do think it unlocks some doors in terms of interesting attackers that we haven't really had the chance to use. And I think this is a really cool supporter for that reason. I also think Rhyme is just one of these interesting draw 3 style cards. We've seen the Averys pop up from time to time. Birdkeeper was massive for a long time. Rhyme is one of the lower power, draw 3 plus something random, but it still seems reasonable enough if we are coming up against some archetypes where you want to be pushing away certain annoying like wally Pokemon and just forcing easier prizes out of things. Rhyme could be decent for that, so I think it's just okay enough to have a 1 copy and have that option in the binder whenever you need. Same sort of thing for Letter of Encouragement. I think there are a number of like basic energy heavy decks right now, and going down prize cards is always making it more of a limited card. Oh, sorry, not going down prize cards, giving up a prize on the previous turn when the opponent has knocked something out, right? But it unlocks a huge amount of energy all in one go. This could be massive for like Chien-Pao, this could be massive for Gardevoir as well. I don't think they necessarily always make the space for this card, but they could, right? It's definitely an option for you, especially Chien-Pao in particular that has irresearchable item cards. So Letter could be decent for that reason. Also, if there are going to be any grass-type Cherim style decks, I think Letter of Encouragement could be really good for unlocking like Toedscruel, for example, Vespiquen, which isn't even on the Believer Buylist because I think it's even worse than Toedscruel, to be honest with you. But any of these archetypes that need that burst acceleration of basic energy, this could be really massive. So I feel like it's definitely one to sort of have ready for when we need it. Also on the sort of top line are also just some like interesting ability style Pokemon, which I don't think necessarily hit the ground running and go immediately into any archetype, but they are definitely worth considering. The first would be that Solrock Lunatone package is a 1/1 count, because you need to have a Solrock in play in order to activate the Lunatone, but it means you're not affected by Stadium cards done to your Pokemon, which is pretty nice, but this does take up 2 bench spaces, which is a little bit awkward. You can also play the Pokemon Go Solrock as well, so if you do play Psych Energy in your deck list, you could essentially turn your Lunatone into a free retreater as well, where the Solrock can attach to the Lunatone, that you can keep paying retreat out of it, between turns or whatever, which is a small nuance, but again, not that massive. It's mostly about the New Moon ability, right? But I do think that not many archetypes have the board space to commit to these 2 numbskulls when you could just be playing, the Lost Vacuums and high stadium count, which is what we've been doing this entire time, and I think that's still probably the most reasonable way to go about things. Clefairy's really interesting. It's a free retreat pivot. It has a decent attack in that you can top up on hand cards, but I think this is just much less immediate than Celebration's Mew, and I feel like that card still trumps any other like early game retreat into style option, and the difference is that Mew can immediately access you, things like VIP Pass or any other ball search that just can have insta value for you and can sit in play if you're not getting knocked out, especially if you've gone first, right? That's the difference between Clefairy and Mew. Mew is much better when you go first, because then you can double dip a Mew ability very often, unless you're up against very aggressive archetypes that can swing on 1. Whereas the Clefairy, you have to be going second to get a grasping draw in any case, and even then your opponent can then like Iona you down or whatever, and there can be situations where you've not been able to play down many cards and you're only drawing a couple from the Clefairy. So I think it's only really going to be needed as a 2 count. I think it's far outclassed by Mew just for that immediacy aspect of things that allows you to just get more set up rather than like ending your turn drawing cards knowing that you can't always access these, or you could have wanted more on the turn 1 rather than waiting till turn 2. So not very immediate, low hit points, but there still might be a number of decks that still look to have this card as a 1 count. And Morwhile as well, a 90 hit points searchable basic that can remove a special energy from an opponent's active. Not a bad card. We've seen Giratina in the past. Yes, that was in the form of a scoop up net, but it could be eventually like a reasonable enough card if there are going to be really special energy reliant archetypes in the game. There aren't actually that many right now. There's a number of basic energy reliant decks, so Morwhile is kind of like a good card in a bad time period for it right now. So definitely one for the binder. This could end up being a reasonable card if the right archetypes sort of start popping up. Ice-Cube EX is a fire-type Pokemon that we could be putting into water decks, most notably going to be the Baxcalibur archetypes, where you can block out the defending Pokemon. So if you are going for like an Iono plus hit play, if you don't necessarily have enough energy to go for a full swing and KO with Chien-Pao or whatever, this could give you that backdoor annoying panic option, as well as fire-type coverage. Now, fire-type coverage isn't helpful right now, but it could end up being the case. So Ice-Cube is going to be in there for that reason. King Gambit, interesting stage 2, does require a lot of work and a lot of setup, but the good news for King Gambit is that we actually have quite a reasonably playable Bisharp already in format, where it does more damage for each damage counter on your Pawniard. So if you are wanting to build around Bisharp, you can now add in some King Gambits and have like a more explosive high damage output threat, I suppose, from Strike Down, which can just simply knock things out if they have 4 counters on them. So playing those Gatejaw Bogs, playing that Radiant Alakazam and a few other pieces here and there, maybe even the Vengeful Punch to tool cards, those sorts of cards, that can go into an already like fairly reasonable but probably quite clunky Bishop deck, and then you again have more explosiveness. I think it's probably going to be too much work and ultimately not going to amount to much, but it's at least a fun thing to go for. Palafin is so close to being a really good card. I feel like the Finizon's a really good basic, and 210 is like a decent number, but it requires you to keep moving in and out of the active. It requires 2 energy as well, which is a little bit awkward, so you need to have a little bit of acceleration going into your Palafin deck. But I do think, you know, water isn't the worst type to be right now. Yes, obviously Charizard's weak to grass, not water, but they are going to have some fire stuff in the mix here and there. And that 210 is a decent threshold. I think it's even interesting for like Lost Box players where you're already wanting to play water energy for Radiant Greninja. Maybe we have like a higher tilt towards water, and then you end up going Mirage Gate to Palafin plus Comfey, Pay Retreat Comfey, turn attached to Palafin, and then you have a 210 swinging Mon, similar to like Zamazenta or Snorlax, some of those higher damage output single prize Pokemon. Something I definitely want to play around with because it is a high damage one prize guy, but it's not something you can use necessarily turn by turn by turn too easily. And I think a pure Palafin deck is still kind of like quite low damage output overall, so probably just a little bit under the bar, but there are decent enough stats that could make its way into one or two things and just be that sort of middle of the range guy that does a decent chunk for a one prizer. Toedscruel EX, really interesting card. Grass typing is getting slightly better with 2 of the new flagship EXs, really, the Charizard and the Glimmora both being weak to grass, which I think is interesting. The ability is going to really help out against the Lost Zone players where you're trying to deny Sableye any options throughout the game, and that's pretty interesting. Its damage output can be quite high, but requires so many energy to be found to actually make it work. You'll notice I haven't put a Toedscool on here either, and that's because I think it's Scarvi base that's the best Toedscool, so you want to be grabbing that one rather than the one from the latest set. But I feel like this could be a bit part player, similar to how we saw Espeon VMAX here and there end up making it into decks. I feel like the Toedscool Cruel, could be making it into decks for a similar reason, even just as a tech card to help out if you are worried about Sableye. So even if you're not attacking with this card, its ability alone could be a reason for it to see some play. The Sizzle's another really powerful single prize Mon. Now, we already have Flapple in format, and Flapple isn't really doing much, but I do think it's a massive differential, the fact that we have high hit points on Scythers and high hit points on Sizzles. That makes this card actually very good at punishing a really ability-heavy format right now. And I am putting a 1+, with the idea being that if you are just going to play a Zoroark toolbox, the Sizzle is a clear upgrade to Flapple if you're happy to play Luminous Energies in the Sizzle list, because it does require Metal Energy, of course, but just that high hit points makes it much, much more usable against Lost Zone box than the Flapple ever was, because 80 hit points was a massive liability. They could just sprinkle on that, plus get extra counters to play around with throughout the game, which was something you were always terrified of, whereas now Sizzle is really chunky and can't just be easily dealt with by Cram or Sableye or whatnot, so it's actually really, really huge as a Stage 1, like, Rush-style deck, but also just the huge amount of abilities that are going on in Charizard, in Chien-Pao, in Gardevoir, in Mew, of course. There's all these archetypes right now that are very, very high on abilities, and this is a very powerful card, I feel like. So there could end up being like some sort of Stage 1 Rush-style deck where Sizzle just becomes that guy in the mid-zone where you're doing a decent amount. Once again, I'm thinking similar to Palafin, how the Sizzle could be weaved into some Lost Boxes as just a thin package. I think I remember toying around with a Flapple line in Lost Box at one point or another. And I feel like Sizzle could do a very similar role here where it gives you some really high burst potential. Again, Metal Energy isn't the worst energy you could be playing in Lost Box because Mirage Gate plus Zamazenta could be a play. But also just playing a gateless build of Lost Box that just plays like early game Cram, mid game Sizzles, and then Sableyes. Like that could be the deck, honestly, because it seems like a very efficient Stage 1 rush. And that seems like okay to me. So yeah, just something to bear in mind. I feel like you shouldn't be sleeping on Sizzle. The card seems really, really good. And the Flapple basically hasn't seen much play because Applin had 40 hit points and Flapple had 80, and that was just horrendous in a Lost Boxy world. Whereas now these cards have actual amounts of hit points, so they're going to be difficult cards to deal with. And I do think this makes a big impact on the form, actually. I think Sizzle's going to be pretty solid. It's just finding the right deck for it, and because Metal Energy is slightly awkward at times, it may not quite reach those heights, but I do actually rate it. I was very close to putting that on the core essentials, to be honest with you, because it's going to be one of the decks that I toy around with the most, I think, this format. And then the final thing to talk about is Revavroom EX. 280 hit points is big. Fire weakness is really bad, though, for a tanky Pokemon, because the idea is we're going to be using Tune-Up to have lots of tools, and it's not until the 151 set where we get the new reduction tool for Stage 1 style Pokemon. So Revavroom comes out the gates being pretty bad, but it has seen some experimentation in Japanese format where they already have 151 available to them. So it's going to be one of those things that we wait on with the Revavroom. But if you do want to try out that list, picking up a couple revs and having the draw engine of regular Revavroom within that list could be pretty interesting. You can use the likes of Gita to get powered up in the opening stages. You can use Squawkabilly EX even as an early game attacker to power up a rev in the back, and then just have EXP shares that could go on your second Revavroom. After your first one, you're just going to commit all your sort of tanky tools towards. So yeah, it's a kind of lower damage output deck, but could be an annoying tank that just really punishes lower damage output archetypes. So that's going to be my Believer and Core Essential buy list for Obsidian Flames. I tried to really talk through these cards a little bit because, of course, I haven't done an impact of or set review yet of Obsidian Flames. I've only just made it back from Japan, and I was out there for 18 days, so it really has been quite barren on the channel, and I do apologise for that. But I am going to be getting round to those sorts of videos as well, so stay tuned for lots of Obsidian Flames content. I'm obviously going to be bringing out my early Charizard deck list, but then I'm also going to be toying with certainly Sizzle. I think it's still one of my favourite cards of the set personally. I just haven't seen the results behind this card just yet to have put it on the Core Essentials, but I once again think people are kind of sleeping on how powerful this card is. Let me know your thoughts down below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow for another video. Cheers.